you look closely at, well, really any of the most viral show-stopping wedding photos from the past year or so, you're going to notice something entirely different about the fashion.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, the dresses, they aren't just, swaths of smooth white fabric anymore. They are literally ballooning.
Yes.
They have actual physical depth.
Mhm.
They cast complex shadows. And that shift is, honestly, it's throwing a lot of people for a loop.
I mean, rightfully so.
Right. Because if you are currently navigating the absolute labyrinth that is wedding planning right now, or even if you're just fascinated by the mechanics of high fashion, finding actual guidance on how to wear these evolving trends can feel practically impossible.
It's an incredibly saturated space right now. Like
Yeah.
the sheer volume of inspiration out there creates this kind of decision paralysis for
Oh,
people.
100%.
It just becomes very difficult to separate a fleeting internet fad from, a genuine structural evolution in garment design.
Which is actually the core mission of today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We are turning to what has really become, the definitive playbook for this kind of thing, which is the article section on the Weddizer website.
Such a great resource.
It really is. If you haven't utilized Weddizer yet for event guidance or fashion and styling, you are seriously missing out. It is this incredible goldmine for highly specific, niche advice on wedding events. And today, we are pulling all of our insights from their ultimate guide to a trend that is, well, fundamentally rewriting the rules of bridal wear.
Yeah.
And that is 3D floral embellishments.
This topic is just brilliant because it represents a monumental leap in garment construction. The thesis we pull from the Weddizer articles isn't about, just gluing some extra fabric onto a hemline. It's about transforming bridal wear from traditional, flat, two-dimensional garments into tactile, three-dimensional storytelling.
Wow.
Yeah, we're talking about the transition from clothing as a basic covering to clothing as a piece of living, moving art.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can talk about how to style a trend this massive, we really need to understand the underlying mechanics, right?
Exactly.
When we talk about 3D floral embellishments, we kind of have to distinguish this from the traditional flat lace or like silk embroidery that has dominated royal weddings and bridal magazines for centuries. So what is the actual engineering difference here?
Right, so the primary distinction really comes down to physical depth and kinetic movement.
Okay.
Because traditional flat embroidery is undeniably beautiful, but it is two-dimensional. It sits entirely flush against the base fabric.
Right, like if you run your hand over it, it just feels relatively smooth.
Exactly. But the Weddizer guide breaks down how 3D floral embellishments are entirely different beasts. These are individually handcrafted petals and full blooms.
Individually handcrafted.
Yes. So a designer might take, say, a square of organza, cut it, heat treat the edges so it literally curls like a real rose petal, and then construct a full flower before it ever even touches the dress. And then that completed three-dimensional object is meticulously sewn onto the gown.
So the garment is essentially serving as like a canvas for tiny sculptures.
That is the perfect analogy. And the craftsmanship doesn't stop with just the fabric.
Right.
No. Designers combine these three-dimensional flowers with intricate beadwork and sequins, but they use them architecturally.
Architecturally, what do you mean by that?
Well, so a cluster of heavy glass beads might act as the weighted center of a flower, kind of anchoring it.
Okay, that makes sense.
While maybe a few clear sequins are sewn onto the very edge of an organza petal just to catch the light, to mimic morning dew.
Oh, it is so cool.
Creates a raised, incredibly lifelike effect. So when the bride walks or breathes or turns, the flowers physically bounce and move independently of the dress underneath.
I love visualizing that. It's really the difference between looking at a gorgeous oil painting in a museum versus actually wearing a physical sculpture.
Exactly.
The depth completely alters the viewer's experience. But let's be real for a second, because I want to push back on the why here.
Sure.
Brides have always wanted to look romantic and beautiful, right? We've had silk, we've had lace. Why the sudden massive leap to three-dimensional texture right now?
Right.
Like, what is driving this sudden shift toward what the Weddizer article calls textural romance?
Well, what's fascinating here is that this trend is being driven by a confluence of 4 very specific cultural shifts. It is absolutely not a random design whim.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, we are seeing a massive resurgence in romantic fairy tale appeal. Because for the last 10 years or so, we saw a lot of stark, minimalist slip dresses.
Oh, yeah. Very sleek, very modern.
Very modern. And modern brides are kind of rebelling against that minimalism now. They're gravitating toward whimsical, storybook-inspired looks.
Right.
And a 3D floral gown physically evokes a garden fantasy. It brings an enchanted forest element into the real world in a way a flat silk dress simply cannot.
It's immersive. You aren't just wearing a dress. You are creating a localized environment around yourself.
Precisely.
So what is the second cultural driver they mentioned?
The second is a total redefinition of how we perceive luxury. For centuries, luxury in bridal wear was defined by how much light a garment reflected. You wore highly polished satin, you wore massive brilliant cut diamonds, you wore shiny silk thread.
Sure.
Today, luxury is being defined by the shadows a garment casts.
Oh, wow. That is an incredible way to frame it. The shift from reflection to shadow.
It changes everything.
Yeah.
The tactile quality of these floral appliques creates deep shadows and high highlights. Furthermore, when you look at a 3D floral dress, you instantly recognize the visible physical labor required to build it.
Right, because someone had to make all those petals by hand.
Exactly. You can see the hundreds of hours of hand craftsmanship. And in our modern, mass-produced world, that visible human labor is the ultimate new status symbol. That adds a richness and sophistication that modern brides are really craving.
Which naturally leads into the third pillar they mentioned on Weddizer, because those deep shadows and high highlights play perfectly into the way we document our lives now. The Instagram factor.
Oh, we absolutely cannot ignore it.
Right. We live in an intensely visual, algorithmically driven culture. Brides want dresses that command attention in photography.
And standard flat white dresses often suffer from what photographers call blowout.
Oh, right, where the bright lighting just erases all the detail of the dress.
Exactly. It turns it into a glowing white blob on camera. But camera lenses and digital sensors crave depth. 3D floral gowns create stunning visual contrast. Even if, your aunt is taking a photo from 30 feet away on an old iPad, the three-dimensional texture of that dress is going to pop.
It survives image compression. That is such a, practical reason to choose 3D.
It really is.
And the fourth driver from the Weddizer guide is versatility, which I have to say initially sounds counterintuitive because a dress covered in handmade flowers feels like it belongs strictly in a botanical garden.
You would think so, yeah. But the design applications are incredibly broad. The guide highlights how a dress with light, airy 3D tulle flowers works perfectly catching the sea breeze at a windswept beach wedding.
Oh, sure.
But conversely, a gown with heavy, structured, oversized organza blooms looks right at home, cascading down the grand marble staircase of a historic cathedral. The technique just adapts to the environment.
Okay, but let's talk about the actual engineering of pulling that off.
Let's do it.
Because we know why brides want this, but frankly, if you sew 100 fabric flowers onto a white dress, doesn't the bride run the risk of looking like a walking piece of shrubbery?
That is the multi-million-dollar question in bridal ateliers right now.
Right. And more importantly, what happens the moment she sits down in a chair? Or 100 different relatives hug her in the receiving line? Do these intricate little sculptures just crush flat?
Well, that is where the distinction between a masterful designer and an amateur becomes blaringly obvious. The architecture of the bloom has to be rigorously engineered, and it has to perfectly match the silhouette of the dress. Otherwise, the entire look just collapses.
Let's walk through how they engineer this for different body shapes then. Because the Weddizer guide breaks down 4 popular silhouettes.
Okay.
First, the A-line gown. This is the classic shape, fitted at the top and gradually widening toward the hem. How do 3D florals work there without looking chaotic?
So on an A-line, designers usually employ a cascading effect. They concentrate the heaviest, most intricate 3D blooms up near the bodice and the shoulders.
To draw the eye up.
Exactly, to draw the eye upward to the bride's face. Then, as the skirt flares out, the flowers become sparser, smaller, and more spread out, visually dissolving into the hem.
Oh, like falling petals.
Yes. It mimics the look of falling petals. It creates a very balanced, grounded elegance.
Okay, then you have the ball gown, which is your massive, voluminous Cinderella-style skirt.
Right. And with a ball gown, the sheer volume of the skirt can support massive architectural elements. Designers will use oversized, dramatic, heavy blooms here.
Makes sense.
Because if you put tiny, delicate flowers on a giant ball gown skirt, they just get lost visually. You need scale to make a regal statement.
I love the mechanics of an illusion neckline, too. For those listening and trying to visualize it, this is where designers use ultra-sheer, skin-toned netting across the chest and shoulders,
Mhm.
and they sew the 3D florals directly onto that netting.
Yes.
It creates this magical optical illusion where the flowers appear to be organically growing directly on the bride's bare skin.
It's stunning.
It is. But my biggest question is about the mermaid silhouette. Because the whole point of a mermaid gown is that it is tightly fitted all the way down to the knee to celebrate the body's natural curves.
Right.
If you add a bunch of 3D fabric flowers, don't you just widen the hips and completely defeat the purpose of the dress?
It is a completely valid structural concern, but the source material makes a crucial clarification here. A designer will never use the oversized, dramatic blooms of a ball gown on a mermaid silhouette.
Okay, what do they use instead?
They engineer microblooms. They use subtle, razor-thin lace petals that only raise off the base fabric by like a millimeter or two.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, they map the placement mathematically. They might place a trailing vine of these micro 3D flowers specifically along the side, seems to draw the eye inward, creating a contouring effect.
So it highlights the curves instead of hiding them.
Exactly. It maintains the refined, body-hugging aesthetic while still offering that modern 3D texture.
So it's really about scaling the architecture of the flower to the architecture of the garment. That makes so much sense.
Yes.
But wait, we still haven't solved the crushing problem. How do you construct a petal that survives a 6-hour reception?
Right, the crushing problem. Well, it all comes down to the fabric breakdown. You cannot just fold standard silk and expect it to hold the shape of a rose while a bride dances.
Right.
Designers essentially have to build a skeleton and then cover it in flesh.
A skeleton.
Yes. For the structural skeleton of the flower, designers turn to organza. Organza is naturally crisp. It has an inherent stiffness and memory to it.
Memory, like it bounces back.
Exactly. If you heat press organza into a curved petal shape, it acts like a spring. So when a relative hugs the bride and compresses the flower, the organza skeleton springs right back into its 3D shape the moment the pressure is released.
That is fascinating. So the organza is the load-bearing material.